Hello, everyone, and welcome to part three of our three-part series on homeless issue in San Francisco, which, as we've talked about, is also related to um, heavy drug use as well as mental illness that's prevalent in the homeless population in San Francisco. So in the first section, we sort of talked about the magnitude of the problem and how we got to where we are. In the second video, which was a short one, we talked about the current services available for people who lack housing in San Francisco, and for people who need treatment for like mental health issues or drug addiction, serious drug addiction. And I think you probably realized from that second video that there aren't a lot of services available, particularly for the number of people in the Bay Area who need these services. So in this last video, the third part of three, we're going to talk about ways we can improve the services that we provide to unhoused folks, to folks with serious drug and alcohol problems or mental health issues in the Bay Area. So things that go beyond what we currently have available, but are at least theoretically doable. So as far as homelessness goes, and also this applies to mental illness and drug addiction too, a very important part of effective interdiction here is what's called first contact needs assessment, which is when folks who are on the streets first come into contact with social service workers, whether it be social workers or people working for some of these, outreach or outpatient treatment facilities like AIDS Foundation, or whether it's in shelters or whatever. It's been shown by several studies that if you can do a sort of comprehensive first contact needs assessment for each of these people, that can then be used to hook them up with services and aid that they need. This by itself can go a long way toward really alleviating the problem. And in order to make this work effectively, the first contact needs assessment, you need to have, for example, workers available at the various points of contact, whether it's a hospital or an outpatient or an inpatient shelter or whatever. You need to have people available there to sort of go over and assess the needs of the people who come and seek these services, or who are mandated to seek the services by judges and the law. And first contact needs assessment involves, first of all, getting something that's often hard to get from folks in these various situations, and that's their true names and identification. A lot of times, folks who are unhoused, who have serious mental health issues or drug addiction issues, they don't have forms of ID, at least nothing that they typically carry with them. And sometimes they're not even competent to give you their true names. Sometimes because they're just so out of it, but other times because they just don't trust people who are, official folks. They're worried that if they give true identifying information about themselves, they can be, involuntarily committed or sent to prison or whatever. But it turns out that if you do have a first contact needs assessment that is not affiliated with, law enforcement and jailing, that this can be really helpful, especially if it's linked to citywide or statewide databases. And the databases can include both the information about the specific person you're dealing with. So, for example, if somebody's been dealt with before, and they're in this database, their personal information is in it, their needs are in it, and then you have another contact somewhere else with them. Like, say the first contact was through a rehab center, but then the next contact is through an ambulance picking them up or law enforcement. Then they can put in their name, and they immediately comes up what some of their issues are, what some of their needs are. So needs assessment includes things like, is this a person who would benefit from a job or from job training? Is this a person who's got mental health issues? And if so, have they been diagnosed? Is there medication prescribed? Is this a person who has a drug abuse problem? Do we know which drugs they typically use? Do we know if they've tried to go through treatment or rehab before? And if we have that sort of database that's also linked with other databases, for example, an actual jobs availability database around the state with folks who are willing to hire from, the unhoused populations, for example, or hire former addicts. Do we have a list of jobs like that from around the state? Do we have, lists of treatment centers that are available, open beds that are available in various treatment centers for either mental health issues or for, drug abuse issues? Do we have a list of available shelters where there's actual space today that somebody could go and stay at for a little while if they're, in real need of a shelter? And then along with this first contact, if you can get true names and identities of people, you can do searches for relatives or friends who might be able to help the person, might be willing to help the person. So some people end up at the street. In fact, a lot of them have actually been rejected by their families or social groups. So you're probably not going to find much help out there like that for them. But other folks, their families may not even know where they are and may want to know. They may still really care about them and even be willing to take care of them for a time. So if you can get enough information to do a real first assessment, like true names and identities and, birthplaces and where the person's lived and where they grew up, you might be able to do friend and relative searches for them and maybe identify some folks who are willing to take them in, some family members who are willing to take them in or who may just be relieved to know that they're still alive. And in that case, if you can provide transportation to, wherever or whomever it is that, might be willing to take them in, and, that would be possibly a very good thing for them. But even if you can't find that, if you can just, like if it's somebody who's economically homeless and what they really need is a job and shelter, if you put them in a database and have it linked up to where in the state are the available jobs, where in the state are the available shelters that actually have beds for the evening or for a longer term, then this can become very useful. First contact can actually really help solve a lot of problems for these people. First contact can also, by the way, involve hooking people up with financial resources. For example, if somebody has a first contact and it turns out that they haven't applied for disability, maybe they didn't know how, or they didn't know they were eligible, or they can't get through the paperwork, you can have people involved in the first contact work who know the paperwork, who know how to file these things, and who can really help somebody, get maybe some income coming in, like state or federal disability, which might make them eligible, for example, for SROs rather than just the general shelters. So first contact assessment is actually really important and very useful, potentially, for a lot of folks. Not for everybody, but for a lot of folks. Useful in finding them, the resources that they need to get into a better situation, and also maybe finding them, somebody willing to take them in, a place for them to live stably. So, that's a real important thing. A lot of, by the way, these outreach agencies in the city, like AIDS Foundation, that do mostly outpatient work, they do have they have some of this. They do first assessments on folks that they can get to see them and come in. They try to link people to shelters and to treatment centers, whatever, where there might be some availability in beds. And, so they do that. But the problem is these agencies that do it, they aren't linked to any central database generally. And so they only know, the things that they happen to know, and the contacts they happen to have. It would be nice if we had really a comprehensive database with local and statewide contacts already built into it, and contacts that actually update maybe daily or weekly, so that the information that comes out of there is fairly accurate and up to date. Again, this can be extremely helpful if we have it. And then once somebody's in the system, quote unquote, the social service system, which we have to stress to people is not a legal system, that's not going to get them in jail or anything. But once they're in the social service aspect of the system, then every time they have a new contact, their information gets updated, but also they're there, and so people can see more quickly what it is they might need. Okay, so what else can we do to help? Well, as far as, again, the unhoused folks go, remember we talked about shelters, but shelters are pretty nasty, and a lot of unhoused folks really don't want to stay in them because they're unsafe, because they're noisy and dirty, because you can get assaulted in there, because you can lose your stuff. So one thing that can help with that is to turn more of the general shelters into what's called population-specific shelters. And we did talk about this last time, where you have shelters that are dedicated to certain groups of folks, like, for example, just women, or just teenagers, or just gay and transgender. That would get people together with other folks who are more like them, who are less likely to assault them or hurt them, and more likely to keep their space clean. So it turns out that these group-specific shelters really are better for a lot of folks than the general shelters. And of course, group-specific shelters can also include shelters for families, where there's kids involved. So, where you can house adults with their children who, so they can stay together as a family unit even through the shelter housing. So more of that. We do have, again, a little of that in San Francisco, but not probably nearly enough. In San Francisco, people have to re-register for general shelter beds every day, usually. So allowing people, for example, to register for a shelter bed for 5 days or 7 days at a time, so they don't have to keep wasting their time re-registering every day, I think would be helpful. And another thing which they've piloted in a number of other cities, including Los Angeles and up in Marin here, which seems to work out pretty well, is instead of having general open shelters where people can go and get off the streets, we have alternative individual housing shelters. These are similar to SROs, but often, not as fancy, quote unquote. A lot of these alternative single occupant shelters are things like tent rooms, or tent communities, or tiny house communities, where each person gets their own little tent or their own little home. These have been fairly successful where they've been piloted because the space becomes your own space, right? It's a lockable space. It's a space where you can store your stuff, usually with some safety. It's a safe where you generally won't be harassed, by other folks. And when it comes actually to the harassment, one way you can take care of that, even in a general shelter, is you can hire essentially security folks, security guards, to stay up the nights in the shelters and in the shelter communities, to basically police them so that nothing too dangerous happens and nothing gets out of hand, and you can control the stealing and that kind of thing. So along with these individual type shelters, SRO type shelters, you can also have shelter policing, essentially, which can be done by security guards. And, this, again, can be very helpful in reducing what makes a lot of people afraid to use shelters, which is the potential for violence and assault and theft. So these are all ways of approaching the homelessness issue. If you have more beds, of course, we need more beds available, whether it's 10 community beds or tiny house beds or general shelter beds or SRO beds or whatever. And by the way, another thing you could do, like in San Francisco, because there are so many SRO beds, is you can convert some of the SROs into like individual shelters where each person gets a room, that they can lock their stuff in and that has at least some security associated with it. So maybe that like in a place like San Francisco, because we do have a fair number of SRO beds, about 20,500 buildings, it might be we can convert some of those buildings into general shelters rather than SROs. Now the state would pretty much have to own, or the city would have to own those shelters, because they couldn't be shelters where you would have to have an income coming from people in order to keep them going. But anyway, those are just a few quick ideas that would probably help reduce the street homeless population, the folks actually living outside. Now, as far as mental illness goes, again, we have laws around this now that make it somewhat difficult. Like you can't just, even if somebody's obviously mentally ill, unless they're deemed an immediate danger to themselves or others, they can't usually be just locked away in a facility. And even if they are deemed a danger to themselves or others, they can usually only be kept for 3 to 14 days or so in a psych ward, a hospital psych ward, for example, and then just medicated into oblivion so that they become less of a danger. But then they're released out where they can, where they lose access to their medication often, and then can become belligerent again, can reoffend again. And you just get kind of an endless cycle going here. Now, it turns out a few years ago, in response to this problem, California passed a new law, which is a compelled treatment law. So going back toward what we had in the old days, where people could be involuntarily committed and treated against their will for prolonged periods of time. In the old days, like the 1960s, the involuntary commitments could last for months or years. But I wouldn't propose that long. Under the new laws, you can be involuntarily committed by folks who have contact with you. It doesn't have to be a relative. It could be like a police officer or medically trained personnel who just are willing to deem that you're mentally ill and not able to properly take care of yourself. And then a judge could, without the benefit of you having a forceful advocate, a judge could impose like a 30-day or 60-day or 90-day rehab treatment for you, where they would have to find you a rehab bed somewhere in the state and then keep you there, essentially. And you could be forcibly medicated for whatever your condition is. So with these new laws, these new what they call mental hygiene laws, we have gone backward somewhat toward the 1960s again, although it's still not like it was then, even with these laws. There's still court proceedings. There's still, you still do get somewhat of an advocate. You're still monitored for compliance. And if you don't comply with, your inpatient stays, for example, you could be immediately kicked out. So bringing back or taking advantage of the new laws around involuntary commitment, I think would be probably a good thing when it comes to treating mental illness. Now, what I want to say here, because a lot of people start screaming when you talk about this, and they're like, well, civil liberties, civil liberties. You're not giving these people a choice of what to do with their own bodies or what to put in their own bodies. and that's not right. And I do understand that position, I do, and I'm sympathetic to it. But I mean, I've seen plenty of mentally ill people on the streets here, and plenty of people lost deep in serious drug addiction, which, by the way, is classified now as a mental illness, which it wasn't before. But I've seen plenty of people in that state. And one thing I can tell you is that the vast majority of people in that state are not capable of making rational, informed, and healthy decisions for themselves. So my feeling is that we should take full advantage of this law and, if necessary, involuntarily medicate folks until they are rational enough to actually make informed choices about what's happening to them. So if we start out with somebody who's just screaming on the streets about, the gremlins and the second coming of Satan or whatever, and is like, getting belligerent with people and stuff, I think it's perfectly okay and rational to take those folks off the street, involuntarily commit them for 30 days, and put them on forced medication for whatever it is that their condition is found to be, whether it's schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or PTSD or whatever. Start them on some sort of treatment which can get them in a more rational state, so that once they're in that more rational state, they can make informed decisions about what's going on with their own health. Whether to take meds or not, whether they're willing to be involuntarily committed. Once, somebody can deal with those questions on a more rational basis, then I'm okay with them making the decision. But when somebody's really whacked out, they can't make any rational decisions about their own health. Nothing productive or constructive. And at that point, I think it's up to society to help them, even if they don't want it. If you see somebody drowning, you can choose not to help them. You can say, well, they got themselves into that situation, that they're drowning, and so we should just, let them drown. They got themselves there. But, I think most of us feel like if we see somebody in a situation that we can help them out of, and it's a very dangerous situation for them, where they don't have full control, then, it's actually a good thing for us to intervene and try to help them out. And this is one of those things. You see somebody on the street who's seriously whacked out, who looks like they might become a danger to themselves or others. I think involuntarily commitment that's temporary, forced treatment that's temporary until they regain some of their faculties and can make more informed choices is actually honoring their civil liberties more than just letting them drown is. And it's, I think, what a humane society should do. When people can't help themselves, you help them until they can't help themselves. So I think we went maybe in this area a little too far toward the civil liberties end of it, to the detriment of all. And then when it comes to drug addictions, we need detox centers. Hospitals or hospital emergency rooms have limited ability to get people through detox. And to be honest, detox and withdrawal symptoms are one of the major reasons that a lot of people who use drugs and alcohol don't get off them, is because they're aware of how painful it is to try to get off. If you've been on using drugs or alcohol for a long period of time, getting off the drugs or alcohol puts you into what's called withdrawal, which can make you extremely ill and is extremely painful. So a lot of people just don't want to deal with that pain and that illness, and who could blame them? The good news is for withdrawal from a number of substances that are commonly abused, like alcohol, like tranquilizers, like opiates. There are actually excellent withdrawal treatments, drug-based withdrawal treatments, that can spare people almost entirely that withdrawal period, spare them the symptoms, the pain. And if you tell people that you can get them off a drug without them having to go through this period of severe pain, then, which is both, by the way, mental and physical, then they'll be much more likely to do it. You know, a lot of people who are addicts don't really want to be addicts. They'd like to get off, but they're afraid of, you know, first of all, going through this horrible withdrawal period. They're afraid, they think they might not be able to make it or tolerate the pain. In a lot of cases, they can't. And then, of course, they're afraid of, you know, what comes next after that. But what comes next after that can be dealt with in a social service way. But the actual withdrawal requires real medical detox program. And the detox program has to be able to go on for anywhere from 5 to 14 days, because that's really how long it takes to, you know, get enough drug out of your system, depending on what you're using, to get your nervous system and brain starting to function normally again. In other words, to get past all the pain. But the thing is, the hospital detox programs, most of them will kick you out after a day or two. They're just there really to get you through the absolute worst of the withdrawal, which truthfully usually doesn't kick in until about a couple of days after you've had your last dose, and then lasts a few days after that. But hospital withdrawal programs are not meant to manage your entire withdrawal process, which again can be up to 2 weeks plus. So I think that the detoxing should be taken away from hospitals, because in most cases it's not necessary. You know, full hospital facility isn't necessary for detox. But you do need doctors and nurses to administer some medical and IV treatments in order to make a person comfortable during this period. So you do need real medical staff, you know, doctors, nurses, nurse practitioners. And you need some place where a person can actually stay and get the proper medications at the proper times for, you know, at least a week or two. So currently in San Francisco, as far as I know, there are no dedicated detox centers, none. If you want to detox, you can go to like one of those 1-day centers or 12-hour centers. That does not get you through a whole detox, and they're not allowed to give you the good detox drugs there that can really, you know, reduce your symptoms and make withdrawing from drugs much less dangerous. They can't even give you those things at the sober centers around the city, and you're only allowed to stay there for at most a day. So that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is true detox centers, which, you know, some places have. These things are fairly common in certain parts of Europe, for example, where they have, you know, separate from hospitals, they have full detox centers where people can really go and get clean. And in some cases, depending on what they're addicted to, get clean without hardly feeling any pain at all. And then the detox centers should be linked, also the outpatient centers too, for drug use. And AA and NA should be linked to this database we were talking about before, where, you know, once you're sober and in your more or less right mind, you can be presented with lists of options for, you know, places you might want to stay, like dedicated shelters or SROs that have space if you have some money coming in, where you can be hooked up with services, social services, where you can, like, you know, ongoing prescriptions for some of the detox meds. You know, where you can get in line for available shelters or find one that's currently available, where you can have somebody help you fill out paperwork for things like disability, so you can start getting those kinds of, you know, financial resources coming in, which can help you get into like an SRO. So to me, this one's a real no-brainer. But again, as far as dedicated detox centers, we currently have 0 of these in San Francisco. And we need a lot of them. A lot of these people who are addicted, thousands who are on the street every night and are addicts, they don't want to be addicts. You know, they know that they're pretty much lost in addiction. They know it's hurting them. They want to get clean, but they're afraid. They're afraid of the process of getting clean and how much it's going to hurt. And they're afraid of when they get clean, what kind of life are they going to have? It's like, isn't it going to be too depressing to be on the street and sober? So again, we have ways to deal with this, theoretically. With proper needs assessments, intakes, linkages to programs, available beds, and dedicated detox centers, if we're willing to put them together, we could really make a difference for a lot of people who are currently severe addicts and living on the street or near the street. And by the way, just when it comes to addiction, I'd like to show you something that depending on what somebody's addicted to, there may or may not be really good treatments for their withdrawal. For example, for alcohol, for nicotine, and for opiates, and benzos to a lesser extent, those are tranquilizers. They're actually really, really good treatments for addiction. Alcohol, there's Librium taper. Librium is actually a benzo. But if you do it on a tapering basis for 10 to 14 days, you can get somebody off alcohol even if they've been on a long time with barely any severe side effects. And alcohol withdrawal, a lot of people don't know this, but alcohol withdrawal is the most dangerous withdrawal. If somebody's been a heavy drinker for many years and you try to quit them cold turkey, the effects of withdrawal are so severe that they can lead to fatal consequences: strokes, heart attacks, seizures. But if you put somebody on Librium taper, starting very early in the withdrawal, they won't hardly feel it, and that won't be a problem. And Librium's an incredibly cheap drug. It's been around forever. It's off patent. It's a very cheap drug. So the Librium taper method of getting people through alcohol withdrawal is extremely effective, super cheap. You just, again, need to make sure that somebody sticks with it, the Librium taper, because it generally goes on over 10 to 14 days. And so, to be in a supervised place like a detox center, would be helpful. There's good withdrawal agents that can help you withdraw from nicotine, which is actually, that's active ingredient, tobacco, cigarettes, highly addictive. But there's very good agents to help people get off of that. And for opiates, there's excellent stuff. If you have an OD of an opiate, Narcan can reverse the overdose immediately. Just have to spray it into somebody's mouth or nose, or inject it into them. And they'll come back from the dead very, very quickly. On a longer term basis, to get off of opiates and stay off them, generally what they do is they put people on gentler opiates, like buprenorphine, Suboxone, which is a gentler opiate compared to the opiates that most people are addicted to, and also methadone, also a gentle opiate. The nice thing is about buprenorphine and methadone is as long as you stay on them, you don't go through withdrawal from opiates, because technically you're still taking an opiate. But they don't, these substitutes, opiate substitutes, the gentle ones, they don't affect mental clarity very much. So higher brain functions are not very affected by these drugs, which means you can basically stay on them and hold down a job, do normal work pretty well. And the only thing here is, you may feel slightly high, but, not more than you would if you drank like a martini at lunch or something. And, they're very gentle as far as their other effects on the brain and the body. And if you want to, you can generally taper people off Suboxone or methadone over time to get them completely off of opiates. These buprenorphine and methadone treatments are basically opiate substitutes treatments. They're substituting stronger opiates for weaker ones. that still allow you to function normally in the real world. But then you can even get off these substitutes by tapering. You can also get off, if you're addicted to the tranquilizers like Valium or Xanax or Ativan, you can get off those through a gradual dose tapering, but that needs to be pretty carefully monitored by a doctor. Now, here's the problem we have these days. In modern times, a lot of people who are on the street are not addicted to just one drug. They're addicted to many drugs that they use on a regular basis. And some drugs that are commonly used on the street are drugs where there is no good detox medicine. No good medicine that you can use to get people clear of the drug, without experiencing lots of physical and mental pain. So, for example, if somebody's addicted to stimulants like cocaine or crack cocaine or amphetamine or methamphetamine or Adderall even, those are stimulant drugs. There are no approved detox treatments for stimulant drugs. Basically, people are going to have to go through a rough time as their body weans off the drug. And the best thing you can do for them is just give them supportive care that often includes IV fluids and vitamins, emotional support, good hydration and nutrition. Feed them well, give them a quiet place to sleep. Make sure they're hydrated properly, which you may have to do through an IV, and get them some emotional support. Also, other what they call non-standard drugs like marijuana, LSD, the hallucinogenics, LSD, mushrooms, peyote. Also, ketamine, X being ecstasy, ketamine, GHB, these more exotic drugs. They also have no approved detox medications. So again, detox treatment is just the same as with stimulants. Supervised supportive care, emotional support, good hydration and nutrition, while their body takes care of the cravings. Now, the good news about stimulants and these other drugs that we don't have good specific treatments for is that none of them is fatal on withdrawal. Whereas the other drugs that are higher up this list, like alcohol, opiates, and benzos, all of those can be fatal if you try to withdraw after you've been on them a long time. They all have really, really severe withdrawal effects, which can kill you. The good news about these stimulants and alternative drugs is none of them has strong enough side effects on withdrawal to kill you. The worst of the side effects from withdrawing from any of those drugs is depression, which can just make you feel like you want to die and sometimes leads to suicide. But as far as the physical effects of withdrawing from these drugs, whether it's a stimulant or a hallucinogenic or a mixed drug, the physical effects won't kill you. They can make you feel really terrible for up to 2 weeks. You can be really sick, but you won't die. Whereas the drugs up here, sudden withdrawal, complete withdrawal, can actually kill you. So the good news is we have good, effective treatments that can effectively manage withdrawal symptoms for some of the worst of these drugs. But the bad news is for some drugs and for folks who are taking different kinds of drugs, there often isn't any one treatment that will eliminate the withdrawal pain. The person may just have to go through it. And so the best thing you can do for them in that case is just have somebody there who will sit with them, will talk to them, who will, basically take care of them, get them food, wash their clothes, whatever, while they're going through the really bad withdrawal and they're basically non-functional. So this fear that people on the street have of going through withdrawal sometimes is a founded fear. For example, it's not uncommon for people to abuse opiates, but also to get them up again, amphetamines or crack or cocaine. So in that case, you can give them something to make the opiate withdrawal more bearable, but you can't give them anything to make the cocaine or amphetamine withdrawal more bearable. So they're going to go through that, and it's going to be a pretty miserable couple of weeks for them. But again, all of this is easier if you have somebody there that you believe cares about you and for you and is, willing to help you through it. And of course, a place to stay with shelter at night while you're going through these terrible sensations. So I would recommend, again, detox clinics be set up around the city where there are real medical staff who can give these treatments, who can give IV hydration, who can give buprenorphine or Librium taper to people who really need it, and who can monitor somebody's health and give them a bed to sleep in for the 14 days that it may take them to really get past the worst of the withdrawal symptoms. So again, currently that's not been set up in San Francisco. I believe that it should be, and there should be a bunch of those. Certainly there's a need. Just a matter of getting the state to pay for the setups and the cost of the personnel and the treatments involved. Okay, so these are some ideas to help with all of these issues. And believe me, anything that helps with one issue will help with the others too. For example, if you were to set up detox centers and get some of the folks who were chronic addicts, were able to get them sober again, then some of those folks who were living on the street wouldn't need to live on the street anymore, and you'd also reduce the homelessness population. So these aren't completely, even though I've listed them separately, they're not completely separate things. Each of them contributes to the others. And so helping with one helps all to some extent. So I think these just that I put up here they're all doable things. They can be done. It's just a matter of putting some financial resources behind them and, getting people who are really willing to put in the work. But that's all. These are all very doable. And in fact, all of these have been done in other locations. Certain other locations that have dealt more effectively than San Francisco has with their own unhoused mental illness and drug addiction problems among their own populations. Okay, so I hope that was helpful and informative. And again, just personally, because I know people who've had to take advantage of these services, I really hope that we can improve the services in the not too distant future here. Okay, take care.